and welcome to Spotlights. This is the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology podcast. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week, I'm really excited to welcome onto the program Michael Northcott. Michael, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invite to join you.
Yeah, I really appreciate you making time for us, especially, I'm in Northern California and you're over in Bali. It's a little bit of a distance, and I'm really glad that we were able to make this happen. And it's, a really kind of perfect instance of the kind of stuff that we're going to be talking about today, because here we are using a global telecommunication system, and you have a new book out that very much deals with global issues, thinking about environment, ethics, science, religion. And the new book is called God and Gaia, Science, Religion, and Ethics on a Living Planet. So really excited to chat with you about this. I should say just a little bit by way of introduction for people who aren't familiar with your work. You're Professor Emeritus of Ethics at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, and you've published numerous articles and chapters, anthologies on topics related to Christian ethics, climate change, political theology, religion and ecology. You've really been a leader in this field for many decades. And some of your previous books, I'll just mention a few, too many to mention. And A Moral Climate, The Ethics of Global Warming, that was a good one. I've used that in some classes a few times. A Political Theology of Climate Change, and a little more recently, Place, Ecology, and the Sacred, The Moral Geography of Sustainable Communities. But yeah, I want to talk about this new one, God and Gaia, Science, Religion, and Ethics on a Living Planet. But before we get into that, because you've been so active in this field for so many years, I want to just hear a little bit about how you came across this. I'm always interested in hearing about how people got into work where they cared about environmental issues, but not just from a scientific or technological perspective, but from religion, from ethics. So how did the world of religion and ecology kind of intersect for you? How did you get involved with it?
That's a great way to start, because it takes me to Southeast Asia, where I am back at this point in my life. I came here first in the 1980s to work actually for a Christian church, Anglican church in West Malaysia. And I worked at a seminary. I'd finished my PhD, so I was teaching in a seminary. One of the things I was doing there was director of field education. So field education wasn't so much going to look at people studying the foraging patterns of birds in tropical rainforest. It was accompanying students going to preach their first sermons and this kind of thing. And one of the most memorable field education trips I did was into Borneo with a couple of my students who were from Sarawak. And we went upriver. We went up the great river Rajang, took my two young children, and it was an 8-hour journey up the Rajang. It was an amazing trip. First, we flew into Cebu, which is kind of a logging town, quite Chinese. Fantastic food. I remember eating baby ferns for the first time there. It was really amazing. And then we got on this boat the next day, the great big outboard motor on the back, basically like a propeller shaft. Not really, and it's not a conventional outboard motor, flat bottomed, so we could get over the rapids, but there were plenty of people on it. It was a big boat. It was a memorable journey of 8 hours, and we seemed to be traveling through rainforest up country. We arrived at this logging town called Palaga and visited various places and tribal groups with our students. And in the course of being there, we met a flying doctor who we'd earlier met in Cebu, and she was going into the highland areas, visiting tribal peoples who had real health problems at that time. And what amazed me in talking to her was that one of the main problems the people were having was malnutrition. Now, it's very hard to understand that, because we were not seeing huge areas of land clearance on the ground, because they had been quite clever, the logging companies. They'd left a strip of trees, tourists like me, on the side of the river, so we couldn't see the bare land behind. But essentially, the whole area was turning into a desert. Now, if I go out into my yard here, my landlord's garden, and you plant a papaya seed, within 6 to 9 months, you're going to have fruits. I mean, this is one of the most fertile places in the world. I mean, it's extremely easy to grow food here. So I found it incredible that people were suffering from malnutrition there. But essentially, the extent of the logging was so vast that the people were starving. All their traditional hunting animals had died. The fish in the river had died from all the silt. And now, if you go back to Borneo, as I did in about 2008 as a guest of the University of Sabah, and I flew over much of Sabah to visit conservation area, the Kanapatangan River Reserve. When you look down, all you see is palm oil, and they've turned primeval forests, one of the oldest forests in the world, continuously growing forests, into a palm oil estate, which is essentially a a device for making money from a monoculture. Quite a lot of that palm oil is used. The story, in a way, gets worse, but quite a lot of that palm oil is used to substitute for fossil fuels in vehicles. And we've been told that fossil fuels are these terrible things and that carbon is killing the planet and all the rest of it. But of course, we're the only planet in the world with carbon. There probably are other planets with carbon, but we've not found them in the universe. I now believe it's highly likely that there are other solar systems with habitable planets like ours. But if they are, they almost certainly will have carbon. So for me, in Southeast Asia, it was the awareness of the particular character of the ecological crisis is impacting on the variety of species, but also on indigenous peoples and their ability to live off the land. And this is true all over the world, really. And environmentalism has also been co-opted by the same agencies, which are government and intergovernmental, not only corporate. We're accustomed to, oh, it's capitalism. No, it's not capitalism. It's much bigger than that. The UN, all the way down, they're all involved. So what they've done is they've said that carbon is this terrible planetary pollutant, and it's changing the planet's climate. Well, we can discuss that later. I discuss it a little in the book. It's not uncontroversial anymore to make that claim. But the point is that they then have created this artificial market in carbon credits. And these carbon credits are already impacting the developing world. So it's just another form of colonialism in the name of the thing that you and I came to care about, which is the environment. So they have co-opted the same people who've been clearing up forests to make money from it, whether it's JP Morgan, who invested, or HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, who invest in palm oil estates, or the companies that sell the palm oil as cooking oil, but increasingly as a substitute for fuel, which is actually, the studies I have more recently published, it's quite clear that it's way less friendly to the environment than crude oil taken out of a well in the ocean or in Saudi Arabia, which is going to do far less damage to the environment than clearing the rainforest and cooking palm oil, having first sprayed the whole area with paraquat and drained the earth so that the methane's coming out of these ancient soils, all in the name of the environment. So there's a kind of double awakening there, I suppose, because at first it was this sense back in the 80s that if I had a role as a teacher, and at that point I wasn't sure, I thought I might have become an Episcopal priest when I went back to the UK. But in the end, I did get an invitation to go and work at the University of Edinburgh. So I thought, well, I have this great opportunity to speak to young people about the future and to educate them. What am I going to do with that? Yeah, I want to teach them to think critically. I want to give them tools to do the research and think for themselves. But I also want to make them better citizens and awaken their consciences to what's happening in the world around them. And that, to me, that was one of the most important things I was able to do in my life, was to influence young people to take up this great cause, but to do it in a way that connects with faith and with religion. I mean, I went to Borneo originally employed by a Christian missionary organization looking at the work of young Christians, pastors among tribal peoples. And this is often misrepresented as a form of colonialism. I mean, I didn't see that. To me, the really disastrous colonialism was in the form of palm oil estates, and now in the form of biodiesel production. So Yeah, that was quite clear to me that the dominant faith, if you like, of our era now is not actually Christianity. It's a combination of money and science.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't. It doesn't make any difference to me whether it's communist or capitalist. Money and science are what is transforming ecosystems across the planet in ways which are detrimental to the lives of indigenous peoples and to their religious traditions, which I began to develop huge respect for, again, while living in Southeast Asia, and as I am now back in Southeast Asia, in Bali, where the indigenous religion is really Hinduism. It's been here so many centuries now. I think one can call it indigenous, and I have developed huge respect for that. So yeah, I mean, it was a way for me to connect my Christian faith, my sense of calling as a Christian teacher, with a larger, the larger concern of the environment, which I think I'd always felt even as a young person. When I grew up in the '60s, and people like Joni Mitchell and Neil Young singing those famous songs about the environment, and look at Mother Nature in the 1970s. So that was in the zeitgeist, when I was growing up, but this gave me an avenue in my academic work, but also in my religious teaching, because I am also an Episcopal priest, and so I've preached on this and spoken in churches. So it gives me two kind of approaches to it, really. So yeah, it came out of personal experience
That's
in the
great.
rainforest,
I
first and
like how
foremost.
it's
I
all
kind of
come
fell in
full
love.
circle.
I fell in love with it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And yeah,
And
the
I'm
goal
back
of
again,
reaching
living close.
and I know as far as reaching the youth, I know you've definitely reached a lot of my students because I've used some of your books in some of my classes over the years, teaching environmental ethics or religion in the environment. And so, yeah, one of I think the best responses to that kind of crisis, seeing that environmental devastation, seeing the complicity of governments and corporations, you're like, all right, I can reach the youth, I can reach faith communities, that can empower some real
Yeah,
transformation. That's
yes,
great.
exactly.
Well,
Yeah,
one of the things I think is really unique about the new book, well, there's a handful of things, really. You've written so much, and yet there's a lot of new stuff going on here. One of them is Gaia, and you're really,
yeah.
focusing on Gaia. This obviously this old hypothesis from the '70s with James Lovelock, Lynn Margulis, and I like that you talk about meeting James Lovelock. Also comes up in the book. So I wonder if you could say a little about that, about why the turn to Gaia. I think there's plenty of people who care about environmental issues that don't necessarily think the Gaian perspective is so crucial. But for you, definitely in this book, it's a core insight that we all need to reckon with.
Yeah, it was really amazing meeting Lovelock. I was at a conference in the University of Exeter in 2018 in the summer, and he came, and it was the centennial conference. So he was his 100th birthday essentially, and it was organized by Timothy Lenz and my friend Bruno Latour. Sadly, the late Bruno Latour was also there, and it was a celebration of Lovelock's work, but also a fascinating conference. The presentations across all many disciplines showed the extent to which his ideas have transformed the way that physical scientists understand the natural world, and indeed the human relationship with the natural world. And at the conference, I thought, well, really, although there have been books which claim to have engaged this theory by scholars of religion, actually, when I looked back at them, I didn't think any of them had really done it justice. I mean, I knew Rosemary Ruth, I knew Anne Promivesi. Both those are the two scholars who we would say came closest in the titles of their books and in some of the contents to trying to engage Lovelock, but they didn't really do the science. And when I looked into those books, I thought, well, actually, they haven't really done the science. And one of the things that's happened to me in the last 20 years is that I've spent more and more time studying science alongside religion. And so it was a conscious move partly into religion and science in this book, which I've been kind of on the path in any case, partly as well as reading quite a lot of climate science. And I really felt at this conference, well, yeah, there's definitely room for another book on the Gaia theory by a scholar of religion. And what's the reason for it? Well, it seems to me clear, crystal clear, and I make it pretty clear, I hope, in the book, that the Gaia theory is simply a modern scientific restatement of what virtually all the religious traditions of the world used to believe. I'm saying used to advisedly, that the earth is alive, that all creatures are interconnected in some way, in a kind of divine nexus, and that includes humans. And I am from a tradition, Christianity, which is not so closely associated with that way of seeing things as, say, Hinduism, or one of the religions, say, of the Batak in Sumatra, or West Malaysia, or indigenous people such as the Dayak and the Iban and the Penan in Borneo, or indeed, say, the Hopi Indians in North America. And that also, so taking on the book, taking on this challenge of looking at the science of Gaia as a theologian, I had also to take on the challenge of my own tradition. Why has it been relatively silent on the aliveness of the rest of creation?
Right.
And is there some way in which a revisitation of the Gaia theory by a Christian theologian, which is what I first started out as, could help elucidate a better relationship between that tradition and the Abrahamic faith more broadly, and environmental science? And so that was very much the aim of the book. There are Christians who dismiss the Gaia theory as a kind of paganism.
Right.
And, Gaia has been adopted by a lot of kind of New Age people, and all a bit Age of Aquarius and all this kind of stuff. And they think that, to embrace the theory which says that the world, even rocks are in some senses alive, is exactly the opposite of Christianity, which Christianity is all supposed to be about the soul, about the uniqueness of the person, of human beings, and the exaltation of humans above all the other creatures. But I think that's only one reading, quite clearly, of the Christian tradition. What I offer in the book is a minority reading, if you like, of the Christian tradition. But it wasn't a minority reading in Byzantium, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is still about 1/3 of Christendom. And if you include, say, Syria, Ethiopia, South India, actually it's probably 30% or something. But yeah, if you look at Catholicism and Protestantism and the way those traditions evolved, particularly in the second millennium, you would have to say that the Gaia theory would come across as rather alien to them.
Right.
And so that was something I really had to contend with in the book. And so I find myself going down some I rewrote the chapter on religion and Gaia in the book about 3 times. I mean, I just kept tearing up versions of it. Literally, I mean, not physically, I did it on a computer, but you know how it is. And because I had to rejig my own thinking. I couldn't just reproduce what I'd been doing before. I mean, I'm 67, but I'm open to new thought. I don't want to get stuck, I'm still doing new things and going down new paths and having new journeys and new inspiration. And this book was that for me. I had to revisit what I've done before. Previously, I tended to focus on natural law in the Christian tradition as a way through to connecting Christian texts like the Bible and so on, and Christian ritual and Christian ethics with the environment. And but natural law is a very kind of static way of thinking about what drives what is creation, what is the world, what are the stars, how does the divine relate to them, how do we relate to them? And I now, in this book, I join my friend Catherine Keller and others in arguing that the whole kind of legalistic, particularly first cause thinking, which Christianity adopted majorly from maybe 7th, 8th century onwards, but particularly post-Aquinas, including the reformers, and right into modern theology. And we need to basically break that up, abandon that, trying to put everything in terms of how the world continues, how life and all its myriad ecosystems and creatures in ecosystems interact, trying to argue that all of this, the evolution of that, the interaction between them, the relationships between them, the creativity that's gone on throughout the long history of creation, is all kind of already in the seeds planted by the divine mind 4.5 billion years ago. This became impossible for me any longer to affirm that. There had to be a different way of describing the divine living relationship. And as I went into this, I found that I could do that not only rather more easily, it must be said, through Asian religions, not least Taoism, with the concept of qi, which is very strong here in Bali, and Hinduism and Buddhism. But also I found that if one looks at certain concepts in Christianity, that one actually find very analogous for qi, or the Tao in Christianity, which are not simply first cause or the law, natural law, as I had argued before. And this is what I worked on. And one of the key people for helping me get there was John Scotus Eriugena, who, interestingly enough, Carolyn Merchant also writes about quite extensively in a recent book that she also produced for Routledge called Autonomous Nature, which is a really fantastic book. And as you know, she was a pioneer in the field, in our field. Her first book was really on the influence of Baconian science. And so she uncovers this very important minority tradition in medieval Christianity of the 8th, 9th century, I got his dates right, Irishman, 9th, 10th century Irishman, Eriugena, who these days tends to be dismissed as a panentheist by Catholics, because he was, weirdly, some of his writings were condemned by one of the medieval popes, which was very curious. But he was actually incredibly influential, including on Aquinas. And so there is a minority tradition, but it is being suppressed, that the earth is alive, that there is this genuine interaction between what we think of as mind and matter, spirit and matter, that they're way more interactive in the Christian tradition than we have traditionally allowed. Now, that does raise a question of, well, what about the New Testament, for example, for me as a theologian? And that I write about that a bit in the book, because, I mean, Jesus, look at Jesus, right? I mean, I've now come to believe that Jesus spent time in Asia. There's a very strong tradition. I don't write this in the book, this will hopefully be my next book. There's some very strong oral traditions, and some of them are textual, that Jesus spent time in the Himalayas with Buddhist, well, of course, pre-Buddhist monks, right? If you look at, I mean, there's another tradition. He went to England with his uncle, Joseph of Arimathea, and went to Glastonbury. And that may or may not be mythical, but the amount of testimony that there is in India to this healer who came from the East, whose name was something like Yusuf, is really amazing. And if you look at Jesus through the lens I developed in this book, you start to see the Gospels in a very different way. Just to give you one example, I mean, Jesus says at one point in the Gospels, if you think of this mountain and that it will go into the sea, it will go into the sea. And we might think, oh, that's disrespectful of the mountain, but that's not the way he's thinking. He's trying to say to people that matter and mind are not connected. You know, I mean, his healing miracles. You know, as this fellow, his friends of a guy who famously let down a man who had some kind of paralysis. And they opened up the roof of a house where Jesus was teaching, and they let him down with ropes. It's quite a famous story. You know, people will have heard it at Sunday school if they're in the Christian tradition. And Jesus said to him, your sins are forgiven, rise up and walk. And people are horrified, you know. And then the guy gets up and walks out, rolls up his bed and walks out. So, I mean, he clearly believed that mind and matter that mind and body were deeply interpenetrated, and he had mental capacities that he could penetrate matter. He could penetrate people's bodies, and there are even sayings and stories about him astral flying, about going through walls. So if you read the Gospels through the Asian traditions and through the Gaia theory, you come up with a different, you come up with a different Jesus. But the Catholic Church especially has put Jesus up there as a kind of king, which of course in his earthly life he never claimed to be. And at the head of a hierarchy, and then you have the king, and then the pope, and then the priest, and then the people, and it becomes a religion of control. It becomes an institution of control. But of course, we've come full circle now. And so what I talk about in the book is not only how we might revisit our religions, but it was also the religion of science. So a major theme in this book, I'll discuss some of them already, but another major theme, and this will be a surprise to some people, is scientism, and the extent to which both the environment, but also agriculture as part of the environment, and increasingly social media technologies like the ones we're using right now, electronic devices, and of course pharmaceutical drugs, and the human genome, and the constitution of the soils out in our gardens, and the plants that we eat. All of this has been taken over by a particular form of material science in the last 200 years, which places huge emphasis on the modern human capacity to manipulate atoms, genes, cells, and organisms, and rearrange them according to human mental maps and ideas. But what's interesting is that this kind of scientism is very different to what I was describing as the tradition that I see kind of coming alive through thinking about the earth as alive. Right. Because it implies that everything is dead until we touch it. Right. Essentially, scientism is a religion of control, and it's actually way more powerful as a religion of control than Catholicism ever was. Catholicism never wiped out paganism. It never wiped out the sense that people have. I mean, all over the planet, there are wells and springs that were worshipped and honored by ancient indigenous peoples that were then taken over as shrines in Catholicism. They didn't wipe it out. They simply took on board these things, and then they adopted them into their tradition, for better or worse. But what's happening now is something far worse. And this is that the memory, which is indigenous, which is ancient, and which I think precedes the last ice age. I've been following the work of Graham Hancock recently, a real heretic, if ever there was one, and I think highly admirable. And his work shows that this belief that not only the Earth, but the stars, the planets, the sun, are all alive, and that there's something about the human which is able to act as a mediator, to create structures which connect heaven and earth. And this is what all the pyramids and megalithic structures that you have in America, the Americas, for example, are really about. This belief is so ancient, and yet it is being wiped out by scientism. We're being told that the human body is not a temple of the Holy Spirit. It's a device for large drug companies to make large amounts of money. Right. By making us sick, and large food companies feeding us genetically modified foods, which wreck our guts, and then we get, there's a drug for that, there's a drug for that, or we spend hours and hours on a sofa watching TV instead of going out in the nature, and then we get depressed, and there's a drug for that too. So the whole of modern life, if we allow it, takes us over this sacred body, but it takes over also the sacred body of the earth, and reorders that. And perhaps what's most shocking of all, and I describe it in the book, is that in the last 3 years, in the course of the pandemic, we have seen environmentalism taking a quite dark turn, which I think is connected with this scientific takeover of genes and organisms. So while many people were locked up, allegedly as a public health measure, which I think now it's quite clear, the science is quite clear that locking people up for public health is always a bad idea, keeping people off of the earth. I mean, the earth is the source of our health. You lock them in their apartments, they're obviously going to be less healthy when they come back out again.
Yeah.
But anyway, leaving that aside, what happened was during the last 3 years was a ratcheting up of what I began talking about at the beginning, this whole carbon credit thing, the capitalization of environmentalism. And what we're seeing in a lot of conservation projects now is the attempt of people in Wall Street, London, Tokyo, and Frankfurt, and of course Beijing, to turn environmental concerns into opportunities for new kinds of capital engagement with nature. And so what you do is you have your market in carbon credits. So you get rid of indigenous people in a forest, and then you say, oh, it's conserved now. But the trees that are there now aren't really very good at capturing carbon. We're going to chop them down. We're going to replace them with fast-growing eucalyptus or whatever it is. And then some company in New York will sell, I don't know, it might even be NFTs for all I know. They'll probably use blockchain. They'll probably link the trees to blockchain using biosensors and satellites. And I wish I was making this up, but there's a project in the Amazon which went ahead in 2021, which I describe in the book exactly along these lines. Now, this is technocracy. Now, technocracy has been a dream, particularly in the States, from at least the 1930s, quite a powerful vision of the way human society will go. But it received a huge fillip in the course of the events of the last 3 years. And technocracy is also taking over not only the body, but the environment and the body of the earth. And to me, this is anti-human, and it is anti-environmental. And the whole message, the core message of the book really is that we need to recover our own agency for our own sovereignty as souls made in the divine and bodies, and the connection between that sovereignty and the agency, the multiple agencies that we encounter in the earth. Because life did not evolve according to some mechanistic structure. That, I think, is now very clear. Darwin's account of evolution doesn't explain. I mean, why after every catastrophe do more species come back than lived before? Darwin cannot explain that. He can't really even explain the upward evolution in terms of consciousness. That cannot be explained by conventional mechanistic Darwinism. So there's clearly some force inherent in the structure of life, which tends towards diversity, to beauty, to consciousness, and ultimately to love. And that, for me, is a divine force. But I see now a contest between the spontaneous way in which that divine force works amongst people and in the environment, and science and technology. The technologists and those planning our future now don't like spontaneity. They'd rather know in advance that you, Sam, have left your house and you're going to go to a coffee shop. And if you've got your phone in your pocket and you're joined up with Google, they will know in advance. And then you'll get to the coffee shop and you'll put your phone there and it'll have a QR code. And then they'll know when you've arrived. And if you pay with a digital currency, they'll also know what you had. And that's what they prefer. And what they're going to do with that kind of knowledge is that'll make the control that the traditional religions had, for example, Catholicism, over people's minds, look extremely modest. And I don't believe, whatever we may be told by Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, it's going to be for the good of the planet. I think it will benefit a very small number of people, that kind of control. And so yeah, that's a controversial view, and we can get perhaps a bit more into some of that. But I do discuss this in the book. I look particularly at genetic engineering in 2 chapters: genetic engineering of food and the environment, and the genetic engineering of bodies, including the gene-modifying drugs, which were rolled out allegedly to prevent infections with this novel coronavirus, which I describe in having very likely been cooked up in a lab. rather than having emerged from some charming wild creature like a Malay pangolin, which originally was given the blame for it. Beautiful creature, by the way, and extremely unfair to blame that beautiful creature for this humanly created disaster over the last 3 years. Anyway.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
So
that's one of the things I really appreciated about the book is, there's so much great material, but then realizing, oh, you wrote this during the pandemic, right? From 2020 to 2022 is exactly when you wrote this, and this just came out at the very end of 2022. So yeah, really happy to see you engaging that as such a clear
yeah.
Gaian phenomenon as to, well, how are we going to respond to this virus? So yeah, I
Yes.
wonder if you could say a little bit more about that and about biosecurity and how that fits in with your whole vision.
Yeah, I mean, I was back in the cafe last night where I started writing. It's called Muse Cafe. It's quite close to me here in Northwood. And I love it because it's got a second floor, as you'd say in the States, we'd say first floor in England, which is raised up, and then you see the jungle. So you're at you can have there's a kind of up, there's a walk up desk where you can have a coffee and put your computer, which I love, and you're just looking out over the jungle. And I can remember being there in April 2020, and it's actually a photo on my phone of that time, and being totally stuck because I was sure that the science that I was seeing in the media about this new virus was wrong. I I knew this because because of my work on the environment, I started reading science journals. And a lot of people in humanities don't do that. They just take it for granted that what they're told that science is what it is. Well, I worked in the Nicholas School of the Environment in Duke University in 2005 for 6 months. And it really helped me. I mean, the reason was kind of coincidental. I was invited to Divinity School for 6 months as a professor to teach there in the environment and religion. But there were no offices in the Divinity School. So I got an office in the Nicholas School of the Environment. And I'm really glad I did, because by being there, I came to understand the culture of science and how science is constructed. Of course, Bruno Latour has done a huge amount of work on this, and the social construction of science is something that I think you have to spend time with scientists to understand how science is constructed. Now, so I've been doing this since 2005, and I've read Latour's work, so I know that science is constructed, just like theology is constructed, and that while there are empirical facts and there are data, there are also theories. And that as in theology, as in metaphysics, so in science, when someone proposes a new theory, there's normally huge resistance. So science is not uncontested. We were told that there was a consensus about the science in 2020 about this virus. There was never a consensus. It was simply that all the scientists who didn't agree with the consensus were blocked. I mean, I was thrown off Twitter because I kept sharing this scientific information, which they called disinformation. Now, the first paper I read, which was an empirical paper about COVID-19, I don't use that phrase very often anymore, thank God, was a paper on the Diamond Princess cruise ship, which was kept in quarantine off of Tokyo Harbor, I think, for 6 weeks by the Japanese authorities. And like all cruise ships, most people on it were my age. A lot of them were on meds. By the time the ship docked, everyone on the ship had encountered the virus in the air conditioning system, because the scientists established that afterwards. They went around and swabbed everywhere, and allegedly the PCR test, which again, it's another problem, but anyway, we can go into that later. They felt it was everywhere. Only 19 people out of a total of 3,500 people had died of COVID-19 6 months after the ship docked. But even when the first paper was written, which was in April, the ship docked in March, it was clear that the mortality rate of COVID-19 was not different from influenza. It was the same as influenza. So something like 0.15%. And it was probably higher in the older age group. But again, the Diamond Princess ship didn't really convince me about that, because there were so many old people, a lot of them on meds, and so few of them actually died, despite being locked up together with this virus. So I felt empirical studies don't hold up against what we're being told. Then you had this amazing scientist, Ioannidis, who was at Stanford University. He was also cancelled and abused even by his own faculty members in the first year because he was advising Donald Trump that this. He did an empirical study. The first one he did was in Santa Clara County, California, a community study. And again, he found the mortality rate where both the infection fatality rate and the mortality rate was way below, 10 times at least below what the World Health Organization was saying. And what most importantly, Neil Ferguson of Imperial College had said in this computer model of the mortality of the virus and that computer model was what led to Britain and the United States and Europe doing these weird things, locking people up in their houses and keeping them out of national parks and off beaches and all that kind of thing, going out in the sun, which is a source of our health. And that paper was a computer model. It was not a real world model. So this experience of living through that really led me to a much more critical place in relation to science in general. I then started going back over all this environmental work I've been doing, including the climate science, and then started trying to parse things out. Well, where in climate science what's the real world data about climate? And what are the computer models? And who's studying what? That's another issue, and I don't get into it deeply in the book, but it is there in the background. And I came to a view on it anyway, which is no longer the mainstream view, what we're told is. But that's true of COVID, but increasingly, in the US at least, my view is now increasingly adopted. I mean, more and more people now think the virus was genetically modified through gain of function error engineering. It began in that work was first begun in the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, place I know well, in the laboratory of a man called Ralph Barrack, and it was funded by Fauci and NIH. And you can see in the first publications, which mention SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2, that because we're both scientists, right? We can read papers, right? And so one of the things you do is you look at who's funding it. You look at where the scientists and the team are based. So I'm interested in geography. I mean, who was where and who was funding it. And the first two papers on SARS-CoV-2, which I also discovered in April 2020, came out of funding from the United States, including the Department of Defense, as well as Fauci and the Communist Party of China. They worked on it together. And the work on particularly on SARS-CoV-2 was done, from what I can see, it was being done in Winnipeg, it was being done in Maryland, Fort Derrick, and it was being done in Chapel Hill. And how do I know that? Well, the patents. There are patents on SARS-CoV-2 because it's humanly created, which precede the pandemic. And there are patents on the vaccines, weirdly enough, to precede the pandemic. Oh, we're going to get into what we call conspiracy theories now. Well, fair enough. I have no issue. Adam Smith, 300 years ago in The Wealth of Nations, says that when business owners get together in cafes, they conspire to fix prices. Well, look at the price of these allegedly therapeutic drugs that we were all told were going to stop us getting COVID, and then strangely enough, they didn't. Look at the price. It's been an absolute bonanza. So the motive is there. I mean, it's as old as the hills, So, but of course, once I started to go, as I say, once I started to look at, so when you see the word consensus and science, you need to be careful. Then it led me down this road. It was like, so if there's an alleged scientific consensus, which is not a consensus about the origins of SARS-CoV-2 or about mRNA gene therapy drugs, then is the consensus about extinction of species true? Is the consensus about carbon dioxide changing the weather true? And then I started, in the course of writing this book, to go into the journals to try to work these things out. And I don't do it as much in the book about carbon because it's so controversial. I will probably do a whole book on that at some point. But I went in and looked at the numbers around extinction in the chapter on biodiversity and religion, something like biodiversity and religion. And it's connected with the genetic engineering, because what genetic engineering tends to do is reduce biodiversity. And that's the main impact of that technology. It's not to save the environment, it's actually to reduce the resilience of ecosystems, make them more dependent upon horrible chemicals like Agent Orange or glyphosate, which is, I'm afraid, all around me here in Bali, rice fields, right? So it reduces resilience because it reduces the number of species. So when a climate shock comes, which often does, I mean, in history of the planet, there's lots of climate shocks, comets, solar flares, sunspots, etc. Then if you have more resilient, more biodiversity, because they're more resilient, they're more likely to be able to come back. So genetic engineering almost always reduces biodiversity. That's the scientific kind of colonizing tendency of the technology. So in the book, I traced this back to scientism and technocracy and its impact, which is the ultimate religion of control, not only of us, but of genes. And then I contrast this with the tendency of the planet left to her own devices always to come back from any catastrophe with more diversity than she had before. Because you have these 5 huge extinction events, the last one being from the Yucatan explosion, that huge comet that hit the Yucatan. It's a first vast crater which led to wiped out the dinosaurs, which is our opportunity as mammals. And we wouldn't be here if the dinosaurs, we could not have coexisted with dinosaurs.
Right.
So it was kind of our opportunity. You had a more recent impact of comets 12,000 years ago in North America, on the North American ice sheet in the Younger Dryas, and that led to the extinction of the mammoths. Now, interestingly, most scientists still blame indigenous people for overhunting mammoths, which is really weird. There are only 3 mammoths skeletons in the world with spear marks on them. There are hundreds of thousands, millions of skeletons of mammoths instantly frozen, mixed up with mud and earth and even human artifacts all over the northern hemisphere, in Siberia, in North America. And the anthropogenic thesis doesn't fit. And this is the work that Hancock and Carlson, which I've been reading only since I wrote that book, Golden Gaia. I mean, I'm going to have to write another book now, quite soon, I think. But their work has taken me even deeper down this road. But essentially, looking at the extinction numbers, I realized that it had been exaggerated. This claim we're living through the 6th extinction, it's massively exaggerated. We have not counted how many billion species. We haven't even named all the species yet. There are billions of species, right? And the genera that have definitely gone extinct in the last 500 years, that no longer in the laboratory or in the wild, is less than 1,000 of all types of species. The real issue is a reduction in the numbers of species in ecosystems as a result of agricultural activity, particularly monocultures, which tend to replace indigenous agriculture and small holdings of small farmers like you used to have in America before it was taken over by the banks after the Great Depression and after the Dust Bowl, and industrial fishing. And I focus a lot on that in the book because, interestingly, Lovelock also thought that industrial agriculture was, for many years, he got onto climate change quite late, and his views on that kind of yo-yoed. But he was consistent that the impact of modern agricultural technologies on ecosystems was generally detrimental.
Yeah.
And I'm completely with him on that. But the problem is what we're doing at the moment is, in the name of the environment, they're claiming that, oh, well, we have all this nitrogen from ammonia production in refineries, and they've closed down about 40% of ammonia production in the last 18 months, allegedly because we're running out of natural gas, which of course is ridiculous. It's the most abundant gas in the crust of the earth. So we can't possibly be running out of it, but we're claiming we're running out of it. Blowing up a few pipelines didn't help, of course, but we're not running out. But if you close down artificial fertilizer production, what you do is you raise farmers' costs. In the United States, farmers' costs have gone up, inputs have gone up between 200 and 300% in the last 18 months. In Sri Lanka, they banned the use of artificial fertilizer, and within 9 months, they had a food crisis.
Hmm.
and the government collapsed, and the prime minister had to leave office. Um, what we're looking at the moment are not natural disasters. The sixth extinction is not real. It's fake. But it's been, we as environmentalists have been persuaded, oh, we need to, focus on climate change and the sixth extinction. While doing that, we're letting these big, powerful players, the banksters, as they're sometimes called, get away with murder. And so in this book, I'm trying to parse out what's real and what's not real in modern environmentalism. Do we need to be lying down on the road, stopping people driving to the store? Is that going to save the planet? No, it's not. I do not believe that for 1 minute anymore. But yeah, I did before 2020. 2020 was visceral for all of us, but it led. For me, it was an opportunity. It forced me to look again critically at everything I had learned about environmental science. And of course, Lovelock helped me to do that as well, because Lovelock also was regarded as a heretic for decades.
Right.
They resisted his science. For decades, they said, no, the earth isn't alive. It's all a cookie fairy nonsense and new age and everything. Now earth system science is mainstream. But what's happened is, in the first iteration of Lovelock's theory, which he did with Margulis, it was way more like the religious belief that the earth is all alive and that there's spontaneity and that it's not mechanistic. Then Lovelock got so much criticism, he then rejigged the way he described the Gaia theory through cybernetics, almost like it's code, software code on the hardware of the earth. And that, to me, I think, took Gaia in directions which I don't think are necessarily helpful. So what I try to argue in the book is that Lovelock and Margulis's first original Gaia theory was much closer to religious ideas about chi, or the divine spirit and the Abrahamic faiths, the breath of God in everything, the wind and the lungs and the blood, everything, much closer to these ideas. But in the second iteration, which was response to people like Richard Dawkins' criticism of the Gaia theory, it became more mechanistic and more Baconian. And then it becomes more prone to being taken over and adopted as part of the technocratic agenda. So yeah, there are minefields everywhere in academia, and but what I try to do in this book is to find a way through them. But I've blown up a lot of sallies on the way, and yeah, it's I think it's the most controversial book I've ever written. And I hope it provokes some argument and some discussion if anybody ever gets around to reading, which I hope they will.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be my biggest plug for it. Is it's just precisely, yeah, it's the most controversial stuff you've written, and so, agree or disagree, I feel like it will be enlivening people's thought. And when you start getting people thinking really deeply and questioning some of the really big power structures of our society, I think that'll lead to some really some fruitful dialogue. And you talk about this an ontological turn, right, where we start to recognize all the agency of humans and non-humans across the planet. So I think yeah, it's exciting, and that's kind of rare in academic books to read something that really excites you, kind of gets you going. So yeah, I think that'll be a good note to end on, just emphasizing the controversy and how heresy is fun, and a lot of these great ideas when you're looking at like
Nothing.
paradigm shifting stuff. That's how you do it.
Thankfully, when, like Bruno, you can be burned at the stake for being a heretic. But you can be accused of all kinds of things. I mean, Graham Hancock was accused by The Guardian a few weeks ago of being anti-Semitic, extreme right-winger, and a racist. He's married to a woman of color. He has 4 mixed-race children and 6 mixed-race grandchildren. But the Guardian, the left-wing progressive newspaper, insulted him every which way. Why? Because they don't like his science.
Yeah.
They don't like his version of history. Why doesn't the Guardian like that version? Because it can't be controlled in the same way. And that's the thing that the progressive mentality, which many environmentalists have, was taken over, is being taken over and used really against us in some ways now. And so that that to me really, it's, but they're very exciting times to be alive in. I have absolutely no complaints.
That's good. No complaints. Yeah, I think that a lot. It's like things might seem pretty crazy out there, but what an exciting time to be alive. You really can't ask for much better than that.
Yeah, very
Uh,
true. Yeah,
well,
absolutely.
great.
Great talking to this. Yeah, really fun.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Michael Northcott. Just such a pleasure to chat with you. We'll have to have you back on because I'm sure there'll be another book out soon, and so we'll have more to
I
talk about.
very much hope so. The current title in my head is along the lines of Apocalypse, the Bible, and Catastrophe. ABC. I quite like it, but I
Ah,
haven't got it. Something along those
nice.
lines.
I like it. The ABCs of our current moment. That's great. Well, geez,
Yeah,
thank you so
absolutely.
much. And thanks
Thanks
to
for the opportunity.
everybody for tuning in. It's yeah, it's just such a pleasure. And so we'll be back with more conversations for you soon. In the meantime, take care and be well.